people, they suddenly, then they begin to realize, okay, this is not a level playing field. Do
Yeah.
you see the same thing when you're
Yes.
looking at the anti-vax group? You see that they all actually recommended it, which
Yes.
is kind of
Well,
bizarre.
personally, I'm still, I suppose, caught up in the matrix enough to resent the anti-vax term. I'm pro-safety. I
Yeah,
was pro-safety in 2020. But anyway, yes. So no, you are right. The ones with the greatest reach, the greatest salience with others, took some time before they realised that they should oppose them. Um, but I'm still not happy with them because I think to a person, they still go along with the idea that there was a nasty, scary virus moving from person to person. And I think that's part of the reason why they've got publicity, because it doesn't matter that much if a few dozen people say, oh, don't take these jabs, they're dangerous. If everybody who's going to take one has already had one or more
yeah,
than one, like
exactly.
5.6 billion people. So well done now for advising people
Yeah,
not to take them, when for 2 years you more or less coerce people into doing it. But the worst thing is that they will say things like, oh, the WHO is talking about the next pandemic, and then they'll talk for 10 minutes about that. Folks, there's not been a pandemic. If they're talking about an acute respiratory illness, they are impossible, because you may not believe this, but you can start by looking at the Rosenau experiment, Rosenaeua, I think it is, Rosenau, who's a guy that investigated transmission of the Spanish flu, 1918 to 19, something like that. And you know what? They never managed to demonstrate symptomatic transmission from person to person. I didn't know this in 2020. I believe the same thing that most people did, which is that acute respiratory illnesses are caused by submicroscopic particles called viruses. I don't believe that's true. And once you look at the failure to transmit, I've seen papers over at least 60 years, all of which are negative. The latest was in the 1980s, large studies where people set off gaily thinking, well, we'll be able to demonstrate this, by bringing people with influenza or common colds into contact with people who with no history of those things recently and who were perfectly well, and getting them to spend an hour or so with each of half a dozen people with this. And you'd expect some of those people surely would pick it up, and they didn't. They did not get these symptoms at any higher rate than people exposed to people who weren't ill. So there were no differences. So that means when they tell you isn't like flying Ebola, they're lying, because that's not the way it works. And yet, the people who Alex just mentioned, who are the approved opposition, they are still reinforcing the scary flying virus in the air story, which is not true. It's quite remarkable. I found it quite remarkable that, again, I didn't really realize this solidly, I suppose, until the last year or so. I knew there were problems anyway. That is, there were not any more deaths during the early parts of the so-called pandemic, when nothing was being done. And you would think, surely there would be people, like, if it was that bad, they'd be falling over, especially the vulnerable elderly. And they weren't. There were no increases in all-cause mortality anywhere until after the fraudulent pandemic was called. So why is that? And that's because there wasn't one. And then later I concluded there couldn't have been one, because they don't work like that. And again, I was saying to Alex before we came on air that I don't like to rely on any one line of argument, any one piece of evidence. A good scientist always looks for multiple lines of evidence, because if they are in contradiction, you've not understood something, or at least one of the pieces of evidence isn't reliable.